We're going to look today at session number 7 in our study of theology. It's entitled A Look at Sin. This is very possibly going to be one of those sessions where we raise more questions in your mind than we answer. It's going to be devoted to a very undesirable topic, sin, as I mentioned. When we think back to creation did not begin with sin, of course. Near the end of the creation, God declared his work good, and later, a second time, even very good. Even today, things are very wrong, and that those things that are wrong began all the way back in the Garden of Eden. In the garden, there was what some theologians have called a cosmic upheaval, the results of which Paul described in Romans. Let me read that for you. Romans chapter 8 is a good read, something that's well worth reading many times. It's a very complex chapter, but a very rewarding one. And in verse 19 of chapter 8, we read this: "For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God." Of course, he's making creation out as if it were a human, which it isn't, but he's doing it to make his points. Verse 20, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, because of him who subjected it," and that was God, of course, "in hope that the creation itself will also be set free from the slavery to corruption and set free into the freedom of the glory of the children of God," which, of course, is every believer who has put his faith in Christ. Well, verse 22 finishes the section I wish to read. "For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now." In other words, he said, things are not right. Paul recognized that way back in his day. It was known clear back in Old Testament time. That notion, by the way, is central to the evangelistic method known as the 3 circles. I'd go to put my fingers up here. I don't have a piece of paper to draw on. But there is a first circle. I'm going to do it this way because you'll see it backwards, I guess. There's a first circle. I label it home, or home sweet home. Actually, in the authors of the particular strategy call it God's perfect plan. But I like to call it home. That's a place where everything is right. Everything is as it should be. The second circle represents what now is a world that is broken. That's the part where I actually prefer to begin, because most people are aware that things in this world, the world is broken. Things are not the way they should be. They're not the way we would like it to be, so that for me is generally a good place to start. But how do you get from this circle to this circle? What went awry? The answer was sin. It was Adam's fall. But now the real problem is man cannot fix the sin problem. So you can't go back to this idyllic spot by anything man can do. Man's helpless when it comes to trying to get back there. But there is an alternative. That's another circle down on the bottom, down low, and it represents the only path home from the broken world. It's the only way to get back to a time and a place where everything is right, perfect, and as it should be. And that third circle, of course, is Jesus Christ. And you get through that circle by accepting the grace of God and having faith in Christ as your Savior. Let's go back and look at what God said immediately after the fall. And you'll see why things are broken. And you'll see that it was God who decided to do the breaking. After the sin, of course. It was a response to the sin. To the woman, he, God, said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. So there's something that's gone awry. It's very painful for a woman to give birth to a child. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So the man is given a particular responsibility. Not one of superiority, just one of different function. He's not going to have children. I know that's not politically correct to say now, but folks, it is the way it is. Then to Adam, God said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you. And by the way, as far as we know, that was the only command given to Adam as far as behavior is concerned. He said, don't eat of the fruit of that tree. So Adam, in a sense, was working under a law. He had one law: don't eat of that particular fruit. And he said, remember that this was a tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. And here is the beginning of the problems with the earth. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Evidently, prior to that time, Adam's work, and he was given the job of having dominion over the entire earth, if you recall. He said, but now everything you eat's going to cost you a lot of labor. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face, we would say the sweat of your brow, I guess, you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. Remember, God took some just plain old dirt to make Adam. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So there is death now that is brought in as part of the consequence of what Adam has done. How would you describe the consequences of what happened when Adam ate from the fruit? Not when Eve ate, but when Adam ate, because he was the one responsible. Okay, what do you say? I forgot. What was the question I just asked? Well, the result, the consequence, was alienation and estrangement that had to be fixed if things were going to be put right again. Well, what was the alienation? Well, Adam was alienated from the earth. He worked for his food. Adam was alienated from God. Do you remember that Adam and Eve hid themselves after eating from the tree? Actually, it's mankind was alienated from mankind. Hate, war, violence, fraud, theft, murder, adultery. You just go on and on and on with the list of violence of one person against another. But what we usually don't think much about is that man was alienated from himself. Problems of self-esteem, self-worth, direction, obedience. Man just simply was alienated from the earth, from God, from other men, and from himself. Romans 5 sort of portrays some of this for us. It portrays us as ungodly, sinners, and enemies of God. That's what shows when you have this particular alienation. I'm going to read from Romans 5, first verse, verse 6. For while we were helpless, that's what we said before, there's nothing we can do about the sin problem. Adam brought it into the world, but man cannot fix it. We are still hopeless. At the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. So, in an unredeemed state, every human being is ungodly. Verse 8, but God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And keep in mind, we are not sinners because we sin because we are sinners. That's going to play into something we'll look at a bit later. Verse 10. For if while we were enemies, if you are in an unredeemed state, everything about you is an offense to God. Everything you do, everything you think, there is nothing in the natural man that can be pleasing to God. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. So there is the third leg on that three circles thing I was talking about. Through Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. Much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. So while there are three strikes against us, and we are alienated from God, from each other, from the earth, and from ourselves, God still made it possible for a way back. Now, that way back doesn't happen immediately, as you know, just by living in the world. Let's look at a couple of examples. Cain's murder of Abel was the first violence of man against man that we know about, but it wasn't the last. A few generations from Cain, we run into a guy called Lamech, Lamech, and he had two wives, Ada and Zillah. And so I'm going to read from Genesis 4, not long after the fall, in 3 verses 23 through 24. Here's what Lamech said to his wife. Listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. That doesn't sound too loving, does it? Give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me. Didn't say what that wound was. and a boy for striking me. So he killed a boy just for hitting him. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. He's bragging about the fact that he is getting even. And of course, God has told us that retaliation belongs to him, not to us. So, now, the word sin itself, the question that I asked earlier, what is sin, where do we get it from? Well, sin is translated from the Greek word hamartia, Hamartia. It's a term taken from the archery, and it implies that you missed the target, falling short of the accuracy that is required to win an archery contest. In archery, the target or the bullseye is the standard. It's the norm. It's what you're shooting for. But in God's economy and life, what is the norm or standard to which we are to conform? It is the law of God, God's moral law. And we fail that law in two ways. We fail it passively, we fail it actively. What is a passive failure? Well, we're told to do something and we don't do it. That's a form of disobedience, but it's not breaking a law, it's simply not fulfilling it. And that's said, they say that we're found wanting in fulfilling some commands. That's the passive part. We don't have to do anything, but it violates such a law. And then we intentionally break or transgress other laws. We tell God, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do this. In the midst of this comes the term that's been used in churches for a long time called original sin. Now, one of the problems is that many Christians, maybe even most Christians, have the wrong idea about original sin. They believe erroneously that the original sin was Adam's first sin. That's not so. Original sin refers to the fallen condition every human is born with, the nature out of which acts of sin flow. So the original sin is not an act of sin, it's the fallen condition that we begin life with. Humans, for example, are born with a moral defect. We do not keep the law. We'll see an argument as to why that might be true. Adam and Eve became morally defective when they sinned, and God gave them over. Says, if that's what you want to do, go ahead, and this is the consequences which we described in chapter 3. No one really has to tell us that mankind is morally defective. All you need to do to know it's true is to go outside and look around. Take a look at the world. Take a look at the people around you. You will know that we are morally defective. But how do we describe Adam and Eve before the fall, and then how do we describe them after the fall to see this difference? Well, an old-time theologian called Augustine, Saint Augustine in some circles, but of course every believer is a saint, so it's not an unusual title. But if you're wondering, yes, Augustine was a Roman Catholic. He's going to do it by using 3 Latin terms. Now, we've been using Latin on and off, but don't be put off by it. I know none of us speak Latin, none of us know very much Latin, but in these cases, sometimes the Latin is a key, because it's so different, to remembering what it means. For example, do you remember the term I used back earlier? Ex nihilo nihil fit. From nothing comes nothing. It's a starting point for arguing for the eternal existence of God. But let me give you St. Augustine's terms. And he's describing Adam and Eve's abilities, their moral abilities. And it's posse, P-O-S-S-E, like our posse. Posse peccare, P-E-C-A-R-R-E. It means able to sin. We know for a fact that Adam and Eve were able to sin because they did. But remember, they were created without any sin. Augustine says that this way: posse, able; non peccare, able to not sin. Adam and Eve, for a period of time, did not sin. They had that ability to not sin. But the question is, what happened at the fall? Augustine says there was one change when they made the choice to sin. Their moral state included this: non-posse, not able; non-peccare, not to sin. Not able to not sin. In other words, now in their unrepentant stage, Adam and Eve were not able to avoid sinning in their unregenerate state, which would have been true of them immediately after the fall. Adam and Eve lost their desire to obey the law out of love and respect for God. How did that happen? God says, you want it, you got it. When God gives you over, there's going to be a consequence, because it's a form of judgment. Well, how critical was it? Let's look at Deuteronomy 6. We've looked at this before. It's the Shema. Deuteronomy 6, I'm going to read verses 4 through 7. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Adam and Eve lost that when they sinned. Okay, verse 6. And these words, how important are these words? These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. They lost that. And you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. In other words, you have a strong obligation to pass on the words of the Shema to young children, to your offspring. And Jesus, remember, did exactly the same thing. He reiterated this point when he was asked, Padre, what's the greatest commandment? We can see that in Matthew 22. That's also in other Gospels as well. Beginning in verse 36 of chapter 22, we read, Teacher, which is the commandment in the law. And he, Jesus, said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. There's that part of the Shema. But Jesus answered this. This is the great and foremost commandment. And then remember, he went on to add, love your neighbor as yourself, as part of that, or on an equal footing with that, saying that those two commandments summed up all of the law. So how many keep that commandment? Jesus gave us an idea. Look at John 6:44. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. Translation, because of your unrepentant, unregenerated state, you cannot come to Jesus by your own power and decision. And he says essentially the same kind of thing in John 6:65. And Jesus was saying, for this reason I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted him from the Father. So first of all, you can't get there by yourself. God has to draw you to Jesus. Secondly, God has to first approve your movement in that direction. You ever thought about that? The psalmist, the prophet, and the apostle all chimed in again, concurring with what Deuteronomy said, what Moses gave in Deuteronomy, and what Jesus said. Psalm 14:3, for example, talking about people. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. By the way, that line, or that single sentence is repeated word for word in Psalm 53, verse 3. Isaiah 53:6, and Paul liked this reference. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. In other words, God says, here's a moral way for you to behave, but each of us in our unrepentant, unredeemed state go a way we choose, and that's not going to be God's way. Okay, and then in Romans 3, and this is where Paul gets back onto our radar here, Romans 3, verses 12 and 13. This is where he's summing up the fact that every person born needs to be regenerated through the power of God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good, from Isaiah. There is not even one. And here's an added bit of explanation. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips. Do you know that the poison sac for a snake when he bites you is under his lip, and he puts pressure on those fangs and then it squirts out the poison through effectively a hypodermic needle-like situation? Well, with Adam, mankind lost the ability to be perfectly and completely righteous. That's what the psalmist and Isaiah and Paul were telling us. How much righteousness did humans retain after the fall? Well, it appears that it could be as little as none. And again, remember, you're not a sinner because you sin. Sinning does not make you a sinner. You are born morally deficient as a sinner, and that's why you sin. So, we got a question. Adam fell, right? How did Adam's fallen nature get transferred to me, to you, to anyone else? Well, there are two major schools of thought, and I'm getting this from R.C. Sproul. The first one is realism, and the other is federalism. Realism is kind of interesting. I don't think it's correct, but it's interesting. It's based on the idea, the notion that in some way you and I were in the garden during the fall, and so at that point we fell with Adam. Two ways. The first one is the crude version: by your pre-existing soul's presence. And there's only one very vague scriptural reference from which people who believe that form of realism believe that their heaven is full of pre-existing souls, or somewhere there are these pre-existing souls. When a person is born, one of his souls is put inside him. Anyhow, they said by your pre-existing soul was present at the fall. All pre-existing souls were present at the fall, and so everyone who would ever live fell with Adam because they were in the garden and were not stopping them. The second version says because you were in the garden in God's mind. In other words, they say that God in his mind saw you physically present in the garden when Adam fell. Now, you weren't there physically, but the point is, if God saw you there, that's a done deal. You were there, and therefore you fell with Adam. Well, I don't particularly care for either of those explanations myself. I prefer the one called federalism. It assumes that Adam was your perfect representative chosen by God, put here in a probationary period when he was created. But he failed the probationary period. Okay? So, since he was your perfect representative, you have to live with the consequences he incurred. Just like if you send a representative to Washington, D.C., you have to live with the consequences of your representative's vote. And some people say, but wait a minute, I didn't vote for Adam. No, but look at who did. Who created Adam and put him in the garden to make this fall possible? It was God. You cannot say that Adam was not a perfect representative. Well, those kinds of issues are never very satisfying to most of us. So, the logical question, still there's another one that comes up. It goes something like this. If we're born sinners, how can God punish us for doing what is in accord with our nature? If we're born sinners and we can't do anything but sin, how can God blame us for that? And there's the answer. Adam was your representative, and whatever Adam did, you are considered to have done also. Since Adam was judged guilty, so were you judged guilty in your unregenerate state. You probably don't like that answer. Okay? Well, neither did the writer, the author of Hebrews, because he goes to great lengths to explain to us about Jesus, whose righteousness, and this is interesting, how are you saved? Because Jesus' righteousness is transferred to you at salvation. Right? You don't complain about Jesus being your perfect representative who died for you, and so that his death as a one who did meet the requirements of a sinless life, he never blew anything in the law. So when he died correctly, righteously, and that righteousness is transferred or seen as transferred to you when you accept Christ. You don't object to that transfer from Christ as your representative. It's only when they say, well, you know, Adam was your first perfect representative, and just like the righteousness of Jesus is transferred to you at salvation, the unrighteousness of Adam is transferred to you at birth. And if you look at Hebrews, you find the author of Hebrews, and I'm trying to remember which chapter it is. Part of it's in chapter 7, the important part at this point, which I happen to like a whole lot. Jesus, in his current state, holds 3 positions, 3 offices. He is a prophet, he is a king, he's a king on the throne of David. By the way, to be the king on the throne of David, he had to come from what tribe? David's tribe, which was the tribe of Judah. And if you check Jesus' genealogies, you find he is of the tribe of Judah. But the third office is a bit problematic when you first see it. Jesus is our high priest. In the Old Testament, a priest had to come from what tribe? The answer is the tribe of Levi. Aaron was a Levite. And the Levitical priesthood, or the Aaronic priesthood, you had to be a member of the tribe of Levi. Christ doesn't fit that bill. So on what basis is Christ a king? Well, it turns out in the Old Testament there was another priesthood. Do you remember a name associated with a priest? One who Abraham met, by the way, and that's key also. What I'm talking about is the priest Melchizedek. You notice some interesting things about Melchizedek. There is no genealogy ever given. They said he has no mother or father. And his priesthood, the author of Hebrews, and I'm stuttering here because this is not something with which I'm strongly familiar. The priesthood of Melchizedek is considered to have been superior to the priesthood of Levi. Do you know how that happened? If you remember the incident of Abraham and Melchizedek, Abraham had just gone out and defeated, 2, 3, 4, 5 kings around the Sodom and Gomorrah area, rescuing Lot. And he when he did that, he got a lot of booty, a lot of payoff. And so when he came back, he was confronted. He ran into Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem, the king of peace. I want you to think about everything I've said. No mother or father, no genealogical line physically. He was a priest, he was a king associated with peace. And when Abraham met him, Abraham knew something about him because Abraham paid Melchizedek a tithe from all the booty from his warlike efforts in recapturing or getting back Lot and his family. So the Jews then would say, hey, look, Abraham paid Melchizedek a tithe. You know what that means? That means that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. But that same idea of superior to follows in the descent, physical descent. For example, Abraham's son, Isaac. Abraham is superior to Isaac in the Jewish culture. Then there's the son, Jacob. Abraham is superior to Jacob. Isaac is superior to Jacob. Who was Jacob's son? Well, one of the 12 was named Levi. So Jacob is superior to Levi. But Isaac is superior to Jacob, which makes Isaac superior to Levi. And then Abraham is superior to Isaac, who is superior to Levi, means Abraham is superior to Isaac. So to Levi, I'm sorry. And so Melchizedek being greater than Abraham, who is greater than Levi, means Melchizedek is superior to Levi. And by association, then, the priesthood of Melchizedek is superior to the priesthood of Levi, the Aaronic priesthood. And so now, since Christ is claimed now to, and some people say that actually Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate Christ, in fact. But in any event, it says that Christ is his priesthood is of the order of Melchizedek, which is superior to the order of the priesthood of Levi. There's also a statement in Hebrews that says, when you change covenants or laws, you change priesthood. So the new covenant has a new priesthood, and that priesthood is, at the top of it, is Jesus Christ. So Christ has replaced the Levitical priesthood. Very complicated, I know. As a matter of fact, if you look at Hebrews, you find that the author of Hebrews even makes another argument to show that Melchizedek is superior to Levi. Well, I'm going to leave it here because I've probably given you enough confusion, because this is a different kind of topic. It is one of the most difficult that we will have, but we're not out of the woods with problems associated with sin at this point. So I'm going to look for you next time as I continue, and we will begin by looking at the notion of covenants, because there are multiple covenants given in the Old Testament, and I think you will find there's a covenant you haven't thought about. At least theologians will tell you there's a covenant you haven't thought about because it's not spelled out in so many words in Scripture. Curious? I dare you. Come back. Double dog dare you. Come on back, and we'll get on with it next time.